Good morning, listeners. My name is Christian.
And my name is Micah, and welcome to the Morning Ponderings podcast.
We want to reveal the beauty in uncertainty and unlock the freedom to be wrong.
Our goal is to explore the possibilities of life's greatest mysteries so that empathy for others can flourish.
All right, well, good morning, Micah.
Good morning. How's your morning been going so far?
Well, let's see if I can recall the things we already talked about. I got a haircut. And
nice.
Yeah, it just gets to a certain length where I just get too lazy to maintain it. And it also starts to look like the hairstyle of the mom from the Rugrats. So it's got to get cut. It's got to go.
It's impressive.
Apart from that, my son's been having a little bit of a rough morning. So apologies to you and the listeners if you hear him in the background a little bit. Yeah, it's been a good morning. How's your morning been?
Pretty good. I got up, had a blueberry bagel. Apparently it's controversial to put butter on your bagel. My wife makes fun of me for that. I do that. I think it's pretty good. And made some coffee. And another thing my wife makes fun of me for is how fast I drink my coffee. So probably like 3 minutes before this started, I drank almost all of it. So like in 3 minutes.
Well, I can relate to that because, and my wife can probably relate to your wife on this, because when my wife and I were dating, we would go out on like coffee dates. And before I really got into coffee, I would just get hot chocolate. And my wife would have the honor of experiencing me just continuously chugging an entire cup of hot chocolate. And she'd be like, you know, I like to just savor my coffee and like take sips over a long period of time. And then I just kind of looked at her and I was like, yeah, I like the sensation of the continuous flow of hot chocolate down the back of my throat until it's all gone. And she's like, well, okay then.
Yeah.
And she thought it was so funny that she decided to post it on Facebook. So now everybody knows.
Yeah. Well, my wife doesn't really use social media. She probably would. But also she would just tell me like, Micah, do you even know how to sip? Like you're supposed to sip hot drinks, not like gulp them. I'm like, well, it tastes good though. And so I want more flavor.
We are two of a kind.
Yeah. It's funny. Yeah. Just a little detour before we, dive into deeper things, talk about our drinking of hot drinks.
Yes. And oh my, do we have some deep topics to dive into today?
Yes. So with that, what are we going to try to tackle? And I say try because it's a big discussion today.
Yeah. Well, we are going to be tackling the possibilities surrounding the existence of God, and looking over beforehand, we do some notes to kind of get an idea of what we're going to talk about. And this whole concept of a podcast is to explore the possibilities. But what we've kind of come to realize is that exploring all the possibilities means sometimes combating certain arguments that are presented, which intend to single things down to a single possibility. And while that might be just fine if they do that with integrity and successfully, like if there's only one possibility, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of arguments surrounding this particular concept that both Micah and I have heard, which don't do that very honestly and very well, very effectively. So a lot of this is going to be kind of diving into those and talking about what might make them possible, like what might make them valid arguments in what circumstances, but also exploring what makes them not holistically valid, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. And then also another thing is a lot of the times these arguments center around a very black and white or binary way of thinking of like either this specific God exists or no God exists, or, and it's kind of just, that's all you get is one or the other. But do you think there is an in between to that? Like, can there be some gray in there or something between that?
Yeah. I think that that's what we're going to try and expose. We're going to try to separate the black and the white and show kind of the spectrum that lies in between. But it's going to be a little bit of a two-parter, but there's going to be some overlap in that this episode we intend to focus on broad terms of what a deity would be and whether or not there's any possibility for any kind of deity. Whereas in the next video, we're going to be exploring specifics as to the nature and identity of a possible deity. And we're going to probably talk a little bit about that in this one. Like you just mentioned a little bit ago, like, does this particular kind of God exist or does it not? And it kind of gets into that binary that you were talking about. So where we're going to really start out is from the atheistic point of view. I've only heard two arguments. I only have one written down, but the other one came to mind this morning for why God, well, one of them is an argument for why God simply cannot exist. And then the other one is an argument for why we shouldn't bother putting any kind of mental effort towards whether or not God exists.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so we're wanting to start there and kind of explore that. Now, the problem is, Micah, so I just told you that there's two things I've heard. Have you ever heard an argument for why God certainly cannot exist?
No, not really, because I mean, one of the reasons for that is the burden of proof. Mm-hmm. Like, who has the burden of proof in this situation? And it is always going to be the person making the claim. So anyone who's making the claim that there must be a God or there must be this specific God, which is often what is happening, that's the person who has the burden of proof of proving that exists. It's not the burden of proof of the atheist to prove that all of the millions of possibilities of gods don't exist. Because for one, that's impossible, because you would be spending your whole life coming up with, really what you're doing is just coming up with the specific arguments against the specific claims.
Yeah.
And so at least that's my mindset. I know we're in the TikTok realm. And so we see a lot of videos from lots of different people. And sometimes Christians are like, come on, just come up with one argument that disproves God. And it's like, well, it's not my job to do that. Or I can't come up with that because you're the one who's trying to prove that God exists. So come up with your proof, and I can maybe disprove your proof and show you why that doesn't prove it. But it's not my job to come up with something that disproves it.
Yeah. Yeah. There is this really unfortunate, lack of understanding that the default position is for anything is disbelief. Like, if you're a Christian out there listening to this, you didn't by default believe in Islam or vice versa. You're not going to believe in Islam unless you're given good reason to do so. You're not going to by default believe it in any way. So that kind of goes for everything. Like, no one's going to by default believe anything unless there's good reason to believe it. Right. That all being said, there are certainly atheists out there who, they are anti-theist. So it's more than just being atheist, they are anti-theist. And they tend to be of the persuasion that God certainly cannot exist. And they have their arguments for that. I'm going to be talking about one of them. And this is one that I had a conversation with a guy at length with. And it's this idea that God certainly cannot exist, or at least do anything within our reality, because without us knowing, because we just have eyes in every place. Like, we would detect it. We would pick it up through some kind of senses or radar or whatever machinery that we have, just constantly monitoring the globe. And of course, hearing this, I found that it was quite problematic. But what are your thoughts on it, Micah?
Wow. That's interesting. I wouldn't have thought we'll have things that can detect God, like as far as like technology. I'd have to think about that one. That one's interesting. But also I think the easy way to poke a hole in that is there's like billions of people who claim they have had experiences with a deity, like billions of people, not just Christians, like so many different other religions who have claimed that they have had spiritual experiences in connection with some divine being. And so with billions of people, it's like, well, we do have eyes everywhere. And a lot of people are claiming they have. So, I mean, that's not to say that definitely proves there's a deity, right? But I mean, there's evidence. So what do you do with that, I guess?
Yeah. So I could see why this kind of gets into the nature of God, in that if God isn't like the Christian God, in that the Christian concept of God is that he is all powerful. And the way I kind of conceptualize that to the best of my ability as a limited human being who is not all powerful, I do a little bit of like independent game development on the side just for fun.
Cool.
And as a game developer who has admin rights over this entire game world that I have created, I can at any time just pause the simulation and everything in it will come to a halt and I can make changes. And if there was consciousness in any of these characters in the game, they wouldn't have any concept of, oh, I've been frozen for the last so many seconds because everything is stopped. Yeah. And so I can, in an instant, just do whatever I want. I could stop the rotation of a planet without the entire surface of it flattening from the inertia, because all I'd have to do is turn off inertia. And if I wanted to, if I wanted to communicate with a creature in a game and they were built just like a human was in real life, like using quantum computing or something to simulate an actual sentient being, everything that person knows about reality exists as patterns on their brain. So if I wanted to communicate a message to them, all I'd have to do is manipulate those patterns on their brain.
Yeah.
And unless you have a brain scanner on every human being across the planet, there's no way you'd pick that up. So I could make them see things, I could make them hear things, I could make them think things, and it would be undetectable. So, and I could do that to a crowd of people all at the same time. So cameras might not see this object levitate off the ground or this fire come down from the sky, but everybody there is. So there is any number of ways that an all-powerful admin privileges God could work within the world and not be detected. However, I do recognize if this being isn't all-powerful and they have to use blunt force to do whatever it is they want to do, then I could understand where this argument might hold water. And I mean, honestly, reading back over the Bible, especially coming through deconstruction, it makes me wonder, like, I call into question a lot of the omni attributes that we attribute to the Christian God, especially. And I think about all those times when God killed people or had his people kill people. And it's like, okay, I mean, if God is God and he knows everybody's future and the way they're going to turn out and whether or not there's any redemptive hope for them, then one could make a case for why God might have the right to take the life that he is given and not be a terrible human or a terrible being. However, it doesn't make any sense to me, and it could just be a lack of my understanding, but it doesn't make any sense to me that God wouldn't just snap his fingers and then poof, they're gone. Like, why would there have to be the suffering of burning alive? Or why would he subject his chosen people to bloodlust through warfare? Like, did he really have to use these blunt ways of achieving whatever goals he had, whether they were just or not, if he really was all powerful? It just feels like there'd have to be better ways for things to come about. Yeah,
definitely. And I have many thoughts and opinions that go into that, but I think that's going to get more into kind of what we're talking about next week. And also if we, dive into that section of the Bible, then, I have a lot of thoughts on that. But kind of going back to what you were saying, I think it's it's kind of funny to me to think of God as some game designer, and we're all just some divine simulation right now, and we just don't even know it.
Yeah, it's kind of like another step on the simulation theory.
Yeah. Now,
simulation hypothesis.
Now we're getting into somewhat conspiracy type things.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I mean, it's more like and actually this kind of plays into the next point, but you had something else you were going to say. It just kind of plays into like the philosophy of like the possibility of simulation theory. But yeah, anyways, whether or not that's actually something that's worth considering, we'll talk about that in a second. So before we jump into the arguments that try to say that God most definitely exists, there's this other thought process concept that many atheists tried to explain to me over the years of my conversations with them. None of them really did like a super great job of describing it, but after a lot of different conversations where it was brought up, eventually I was able to kind of piece it together, and I think I know how to describe it best now. And it's this idea of the way I generally hear it put, and I don't know if you've heard it put this or heard this at all, but it's this idea of like, if God exists and magic is real, then nothing matters. Everything we've observed, it just is pointless. Have you ever heard that before?
I've heard things similar to that. Like I've heard the idea of, if there is some objective and highest, like godlike purpose, then everything is purposeless. And I do understand that concept, but just the existence of a God, I haven't heard that makes life purposeless. So I'm curious. Explain.
I'm also curious on your end. So maybe we'll talk about this and then talk about that. So this concept, and the way I like to think about it is, we as human beings are built in such a way where everything we know about the world external to us, and I mentioned this a little bit ago, it exists as patterns etched into our brains by sensory inputs. And the thing about these sensory inputs is we can use them to even know they're not always accurate. Like sometimes they are on the fritz, sometimes they're being deceived. And that can play into the idea of simulation theory. Like, who knows if this is all just some computer simulation? It could play into illusory or illusions. So a magician constantly, that's like their whole living. The very fact that there are flaws in human perception, that's what they take advantage of. And so we are fully dependent upon potentially faulty senses to know anything about our reality and our existence.
Yeah.
And so one must then ask the question, why is it that we choose to trust our senses and choose to believe that this reality is at all meaningful? And the only so I'll ask you the question.
Okay.
What do you think about that concept of like, how do we then assign any kind of value to what we perceive? Is this something you've thought about at all?
I think yes. I have been thinking about it in a more roundabout way, but our senses are all we have. Like I made a video recently that like your body and your senses is all that you have. Like if you're going to perceive anything in the world, think about anything, like you're going to be using your senses, and that's literally all you have. And so while I agree, our senses do trick us sometimes. Like people have hallucinations, people, see things that aren't there or perceive things that aren't there. And sometimes our senses can lie to us and lead us astray. But in the end, you have to trust your senses to some degree, because you have to understand that they're not going to be perfect and you're going to get things wrong sometimes, but you do have to trust them, because everything, even your perception of there being a divine being and having interactions with that, is coming through where? It's coming through your senses. And so you have to trust those senses to some extent to give you correct information. And I would lean on the side of trusting more in your senses than less.
Yes. And I think you're actually right on the right track for why atheists feel we shouldn't consider a God. And that is this whole idea of like, should your senses happen to be consistent in the information they deliver to you, such that you can use that consistent information to plan ahead and create meaning for your actions and your life, then that forms what you're basically stuck between is, do I reject my senses and live a meaningless life, or do I accept them and the consistency they offer to make as much of a meaningful life as I can for myself? And the trouble with that is that when we choose to accept our senses and try our best to make as meaningful a life and existence as we can for ourselves, where our senses take us is, or where they have taken us, is to this place where we can look at creation or the universe. It doesn't have to have been created.
Right.
We'll talk about that. But we can look at the universe and see that in the future, where everything is headed, with entropy on the rise, our inevitable future is that the entire universe will expand until basically all matter has evaporated into raw energy. And it kind of seems like everything, any meaning that we assign to ourselves in this existence is temporary and will end inevitably. And so it kind of creates this paradox of the very reasons we choose to value our senses eventually takes us to the conclusion that it's going to be ultimately meaningless in the end. Or rather, any meaning is not going to last specifically. You can create meaning for yourself in the temporary and find value in that. And that's something that I've been wrestling with and had a lot of conversations with people about. But there's that reality. And the trouble is, now you're faced with, do I reject my senses and choose to believe that there is a reality beyond my senses? Like,
I see.
And at that point, if I'm rejecting the one thing that I have in favor of something that could exist, but I don't necessarily, it doesn't fall within the realm of the one thing that I have, the only things that make my existence meaningful, then in that instance, I am choosing that nothing matters, that my perceptions and the ultimate conclusion that they arrive at don't matter. And what matters more is this hypothesis.
Wow.
And that is what I feel like a lot of atheists are trying to get at when they say, if God exists and there's magic and everything in our universe is not what it appears, then it's all for naught.
Okay. Yes. Okay. That got deep real quick. I definitely see what you're saying there. And that is, I think, a fascinating argument and probably a compelling one for me. I think maybe I should throw a wrench in this real quick and say, well, what if everything is just meaningless already? And that's kind of what I was saying earlier. Like, maybe everything just already is meaningless, and maybe that's the best thing ever. And now this is definitely getting into a different conversation, but I think it's an important conversation that maybe we'll circle back to at some point. But
we can do like a part 3 or something.
Sure. Just meaning of life. My goodness.
Well, I mean, let's tackle this now. And if we don't get around to talking about the Christian arguments for why there must be a God, then we can just make that a different episode.
Yeah. So I follow Abraham Piper on TikTok, where he's made a few videos on like meaning of life, and he's John Piper's son, who has obviously been like excommunicated because he ran away from Reformed theology, and I don't think he believes in anything anymore. But he talks about how meaninglessness is not necessarily a bad thing, because if everything is meaningless to start, then meaning is what you make of it. Like, everything in life can be meaningful if you choose to make it meaningful. So like waking up and eating a bagel with butter on it can be meaningful. It can be a meaningful experience, not because the universe is like because the universe or God has decided that experience is meaningful, but because you did. You decided that experience was meaningful. And there's something beautiful about that, and in us pursuing our own meaning in life and saying, this is what is meaningful to me. And this is what even like my senses bring in that makes my life meaningful. And there's something beautiful about that, because he talks about, I guess I'll get into the whole, if there is an ultimate purpose, everything is meaningless. Because if there's an ultimate purpose, then what is my bagel with butter if there's an ultimate purpose? Like, that is meaningless compared to this ultimate purpose.
Wow.
And so
that's really interesting.
If I don't find the ultimate purpose, then everything in my life is meaningless, right? Because I haven't reached it. But who can say what that ultimate purpose is and what it even means to get there? And how can we reach that as, finite, imperfect people who are not ultimate? How can we find an ultimate purpose?
Yeah, there's so much truth to that, because like I'm even thinking back to our introductory episode and how we had talked a bit about how growing up in the Christian sphere, you're kind of under this impression that the most important thing is sharing Jesus. And that is the ultimate purpose. And so it's hard to enjoy other things in life because it feels like you're wasting your time. Exactly. I should be out there doing this thing or that thing. So I see the truth in that.
Yeah.
Super fascinating.
Yeah, because, if that is the ultimate purpose, if getting to heaven, or for some avoiding hell, really, for being honest, if that's the ultimate purpose, then what is the point of going to a restaurant and eating nice food? What's the point? You should be out sharing Jesus. You should only be eating food so that you can live. And then you should be out sharing Jesus. What's the point of working? Like, what's the point of buying a house? Especially to the people who are like, Jesus could come back at any moment, which I think that's a new thing in Christian history. But anyway, I guess it's not super new. Everybody thought it was always the end of the world.
Now, I will say, like, given the possibility that is the truth, given the possibility that is the ultimate purpose, then I totally get that. Like, it totally makes sense that we like to prioritize doing that over enjoying life, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
However, I think that especially this might be something we dive into more in future episodes, but just exploring the idea of like salvation, this whole concept of salvation, the idea of sin and evangelism and the issues that kind of come with that and how it comes up against especially like Christian theology. That's a really that's a fascinating topic we'll have to talk on. So
definitely.
Was there more you had to say on that?
I think the last thing I just want to throw in there, because I think what you said is really important, is that to me, even like not necessarily knowing what I believe about some God existing right now, that doesn't mean that there cannot be meaning if there is a God for me. Yes. I don't believe that. Now, I think there are certain versions of God or even the Christian God that I believe would take away that meaning. But there are versions that I think definitely do not and could add meaning. And so I just want to throw that in there because it's not a black and white thing for me. And as we talk about, it's not. The whole issue is not.
Yeah. And I also want to like, I want to make sure that we don't end this particular part of this particular segment with the impression that we shouldn't even consider God. I think that there is a very valid argument to be found in the idea of like, we shouldn't just choose to believe that a God exists and forsake everything that we think that our senses have provided us, all of that meaning. We shouldn't do that. However, I mean, not without good reason. If God shows himself in a very consistent way and makes himself a very obvious part of our reality, then at that point, you're rejecting the reality that your senses have told you is valuable. But until then, I think that there's value to be found in hope. If like I personally have wrestled with, and recently I've kind of come to understand a little bit better, but wrestled with the idea of existence being the same after you die as it was before you were born. And there's no fear in the time preceding your birth. So what kind of fear should you have for the time after your death? So that was something that I was wrestling with. And I always thought, like, well, I mean, once you start to exist, you kind of grow attached to existing. And the desire to learn and the desire to, I think it's a little bit of FOMO, fear of missing out. Yeah. And that it's like, man, there's just so much I would love to try and so much I'd love to learn. And it makes it hard to embrace nothingness. But on the flip side of that, like you said, like if there's a greater purpose, then suddenly it's not important to try everything. But I mean, also if that comes packaged with eternity, then maybe eventually you'll be able to get around to that. So I don't know.
Sure.
But all that to be said, I'm slowly becoming more comfortable with the idea of existence being the same after death, but I can still find hope. I can still hope for the possibility that life goes on after death, like that there is a benevolent God with the intentions to give more, to make existence more than just this short burst of possibly pleasure, then to end in suffering and death. And maybe even just nothing but suffering and then death in some people's cases, which is tragic. Yeah. And I could totally see why they would be like, well, I don't want to experience any more of this. I'm totally fine with just ceasing to exist. Thank you very much. And that's something that I consider like, you know what, I can totally get why somebody would choose not to even consider God, because not existing kind of would seem pretty great from somebody whose experience with existence has only been suffering and misery. Yeah. I think that there is value that can be found in hoping that especially certain kinds of gods exist. Yeah.
And I would agree. I share that hope, Yes. I am still slightly terrified by the idea of just non-existing. And I think that's my survival instinct being like, no, you must live, because all of us want to continue to live. Like, who doesn't want to live forever? That's why, people would sail across the ocean to try to find the fountain of youth, because they wanted to live forever, which still haven't found it. Let me know. News breaks. Yeah. But yeah, I can definitely hope that there could be something, but there are definitely certain versions, which we will talk about eventually, of afterlife that I definitely hope do not exist.
And I want to make sure I emphasize, hope is not intellectually compromising, or at least it doesn't compromise the value that you get from your senses. You can hope that a hypothesis has some merit to it without promoting it or accepting it as an absolute reality. And I think that that's where, until God should choose to give me more information to be certain that he exists, that's kind of where I fall. It's that I can have hope that God exists. I can have hope that God doesn't exist. I can have them simultaneously, so long as I don't know. And so long as God sees it fit to allow both to remain a possibility. So yeah,
I agree. Hope is good. Hope is good.
So one of the big things, and this touches a little bit on something on the rest of my story, when how did my family take me questioning stuff that you had asked me last episode? And one of the things I've learned through kind of going back and forth with them on why it is that they feel so certain and so confident, or rather just so certain, because I also have a certain amount of confidence. And the thing about confidence is it's quantitative. Like, you don't have it or don't. It's you either have a lot, a little, or none. And I have a little bit of confidence that I kind of go on, that I feel like warrants my hope. But anyways, that's aside from the point. I've been asking my parents a lot, and there's been a lot of conversation about why it is they feel so absolutely certain. And one of the things that my dad brought up was that there has been very real, tangible ways that Christianity has helped my family to become more stable, has helped my dad and my mom's relationship, taught us principles that just keep our family from falling apart. And I mean, I can look back and I can see the truth in that. Like, that is very much true. In that prior to Christianity entering into my family's life, they were struggling quite a bit more. Like, I never really felt that, but I mean, I've heard the stories, so who knows how exaggerated it is, but I like to trust that it wasn't. I trust my parents in that way. Have you ever heard that particular idea that, like, well, we can know that the Bible is absolutely true because what it teaches works?
Yes, I have. And what I would say to that is, and I want this to come across in a way that is not invalidating, because I think that experience is valid. And I think that's true. And I think that's beautiful. And that is what has been true for your family. And I validate that. I think that is beautiful. At the same time, other people in other religions have had those same experiences. And so just because you've had that experience with your religion of choice or not choice, you know, what, I guess, whatever, you kind of choose it, but you can also grow up around it. People in other religions or atheists who have left Christianity have said, you know, my life got so much better after I left Christianity. And I have friends on TikTok who I watched their life while they were in Christianity. And then when they left, and they're much happier now and much more stable. And they're actually in a really bad situation when they were in Christianity. So I do not invalidate that experience, because I think that is good. And I am genuinely happy for your family that has been their experience. At the same time, that doesn't mean that is the only place that happens. And that is the only truth, I guess, that you find that life in.
Yeah, the one thing that I kind of circle back around to whenever I hear that and think about it, and it's this idea, like, well, if you were to take the most influential self-help book and then just include in it, by the way, this is all divinely inspired.
Yeah.
Is the fact that self-help book is effective and helps people's lives become better and contains those truths about human psychology enough to warrant belief that it is divinely inspired?
Yeah.
And it just seems like a criteria that would be too easy for any book or any attempt to claim divine truth to meet.
Definitely. And I think that's where we get into, that doesn't prove, it doesn't like disprove.
Yes.
It's you can call that evidence, and that's great.
I am on the same boat, on the same page with you. And I think that this also shares a lot in common with the idea of divine revelation and like the experience of miraculous things or prayers being answered. And that I think that there's a very similar thing that can be said towards that assertion as proof that the religion is true, and that you hear that from pretty much any religion. Like, all people all over the place have these claims, and it actually really makes me wonder, like, if there is a God, I get the hunch that they are just a generally benevolent God. They don't care what religion you fall under, or if you even fall under one, or if you even believe in them, so long as what your goal and intention is for the betterment of humanity and is ultimately goodwill towards man, then they're going to bless you. They're going to work miracles in your life. And that's the best way I can make sense of, oh, well, there's miracles in every religion that is claimed. And so it really makes me wonder if that is a possible attribute as to the nature of God, which we'll talk about again more about next time.
Yeah. I think,
what are your thoughts?
Yeah, man, you're starting to dip your toes into like Unitarianism, which is, you know, all roads lead to the same thing. Which is, you know,
is definitely that Universalism?
Yes. I mean, that would be also Universalism. Unitarians are Universalists, but Unitarians, it's hard to define them. We actually have like a thing called Unity Village. Like, it's in Kansas City that like is a village of people who are Unitarians, and they're from like all different religions. And it's actually a beautiful place, but they're universalists. So I guess we could just call it universalism. Though
I had my eyes on Unitarian Universalists and Christian Universalists for a little bit. I haven't had a chance to really dive into the nuances of them, but I do like the idea of universalism. I do have my opinions on that, which we'll probably talk about at another thing because that's apart from the point. But yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, I think I would agree. Like even when I watched the show Wild Wild Country, which is a fantastic Netflix show, and you should definitely watch it. But it's about a cult that happened. You know, it probably still exists. That was following the Bhagwan, and they were all the sannyasins, and they had, you know, spiritual experiences, and they had videos of people talking about like saying very similar things that people say in Christianity. And it's like, who am I to say that that experience was not real? Now, granted, it was a cult. So that's another thing.
Mm-hmm.
But they still had experiences that they would call experiencing from the divine. Who am I to say that that was wrong?
Yeah.
And it didn't happen.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, it's not my place to invalidate another person's life experiences. However, when those life experiences are shared with me, unfortunately, because they're not my life experiences, I can't just take them as though they were.
Yeah.
No matter how much I trust this person. Like, there's always that possibility that maybe they just had a hallucination. Maybe everybody was tripping on the same drug for some reason, or there was some kind of a chemical in the air. Who knows? Yeah. There's a lot of possible explanations, but maybe it was true. And so for me, I can only take that as an assurance that God might exist, and to further assure my hope for that possibility. But yeah, I'm totally on the same page with you on there.
And I'll also throw in there that also does not warrant, you know, just because you have some experience, that does not give you permission to do whatever your religion says is good and okay. Because, for example, in that cult, there were some real sketch things happening. And just because people had experiences that you would say are good or from the divine, that does not mean that everything happening there was morally okay, because it definitely was not.
For sure. And then like there's even the whole instance, I don't know if you heard about like the Father Divine cult. Like I watched a documentary on that, and it was just this idea, like some guy was claiming to be God come back to the earth, and a bunch of people believed him and bought into miraculous signs of his. And in the end, they all went to a commune somewhere random and then just mass suicided.
No.
And it's like I hear that story, and then I hear all the people who, and we'll actually get into this. This actually leads into this idea of like, a lot of people say that Christianity in the Bible is true because people died for it, because they died for this truth. And I think to the Father Divine instance, and I'm like, well, people died for that lie. And also there are people, and there was a time in my life where even though I didn't have certainty that Christianity was true, I was ready to die for it.
Yeah.
So that particular argument I do not find super compelling and convincing, but I do recognize that if somebody is willing to die for something, that makes it less likely to be a lie. But it's also just possible they just believe it, or they heard from somebody that was really convincing enough that made them believe it.
Yeah, I mean, even thinking of people around, you know, like the Apostolic Era, like, yeah, the apostles were dying because they believed in Jesus, but the Romans were dying because they thought Caesar was God, you know. So like they believed that, and the apostles believed that Jesus was God, or that, you know, the God that their ancestors worshipped was God. So like they both were dying for what they believed in. Yeah. So sure, you could say maybe that makes it more valid, because at least they know, at least they're not like claiming something and then like backpedaling as soon as someone challenges them to death. But lots of people have done that. So it doesn't necessarily, once again, doesn't prove anything. Just another thing to add to the thought process.
To kind of zero in, so this kind of is a little more specific to our backgrounds. But I mean, you could apply this to any holy book, really, because there's similar claims. But one of the proofs that's touted, or supposed proofs that's touted as for why Christianity is true, is the historical accuracy of the Bible, and how we find archaeological evidence that suggests that these places were real and these people were real. And I could just be not necessarily fully understanding why people then take this and then say, therefore, we have reason to believe that all of the Bible's claims are true.
Yeah.
I don't see how you can quite make that jump. Do you have any like insights into that mindset that maybe I'm not clued into?
Yeah, I mean, that mindset comes out of fundamentalism, which is the idea that everything in the Bible is factually true, not just like that there is truth in the Bible, whether that is an actual historical narrative or mythology, like, did the story of Jonah really happen? Does it matter that the story of Jonah actually happened? So fundamentalists are going to say it does matter that the story of Jonah happened, because if it didn't happen and Jonah wasn't in that fish for 3 days, then the whole story is a lie and there's no truth in it. And I was misled by God. I would say that is a very narrow way of viewing truth, because truth is so much more than just history and what actually happened. Like if the story of Jonah did not happen, is there still something beautiful and true about that story that speaks to our human experience in having enemies, not wanting to forgive them, and then being angry when forgiveness falls upon our enemies? Is there something that can challenge us to be better humans through that story, whether or not it actually happened? So, but that's the mindset, is that if it didn't factually happen, historically happen, like if the exile did not happen, if Genesis did not happen exactly how it says, then all of this was a lie. That's actually a very new perspective in Christianity, like in the last 200 years. Like that is not how Christians or even first century Judaism would have thought about those stories, because that wasn't a concern. That wasn't the main concern.
I think one of the big things that really changed the way I looked at the Bible was the whole idea, and you were just talking a lot about it. It's this idea, like, there's a lot of explicit parables in the Bible where fictional stories are being used to teach real valuable lessons. But there's also this idea that there might be a lot of implicit parables in the Bible. And that might explain the whole story of Jonah, and how, like, there's a lot of exaggeration in the story of Jonah about how, like, Nineveh was this massive city, and it talks about how it takes, I think, like 3 days to walk from one end to the next, when really it would only take you like maybe half a day. But there's a lot of exaggeration in there that could be explained if it's an implicit parable, not something that's explicitly stated as one. It also would make sense for why there's such a difference between the first creation account and the second creation account. And the first creation account being the chapter 1, second in chapter 2, and how in one of them it talks about how, and I think you even mentioned this in one of your videos at one point, how God created the plant life, and the plants sprouted from the ground and were mature enough that they were bearing seeds and fruit. And that all happened before God created humans. And then you go to chapter 2 and it's like, now, no, none of the plants had sprouted from the ground yet. And then God created man from the dust. And it's like, okay, which one is it? And it makes a lot more sense if you think of Genesis 1 as a parable that's purpose is to, one, show the beauty of creation and like God as the creator and how it all came to be. And then 2, the importance of the 7th day of rest. And that's like the basis of the Sabbath or whatever. But maybe it shouldn't be taken literally, because it is parabolic in nature and doesn't mesh well with the second account. I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't know if I have not been given good enough reason to look at any of the Bible and say, oh yes, this is absolutely true. So this is largely coming from like when I was in that mindset of like, there are parts of it that must be true. How does it all fit together to be absolutely true? That was a common way I would like to think about it, is like, well, then if this doesn't mesh well with this, then maybe one of them is parabolic in nature.
Yeah. And I think it's important to throw this in there, because this is what we do, is if you hold that view and think, like, if you're listening to us right now and you're like, you guys are crazy, you can't believe that, and I look at you and I think, well, I think it's unreasonable to believe what you believe. I just want you to know, we hold space for that here, and you can still believe that and have a beautiful faith and live a life that is full of goodness and beauty. And I think that is totally possible, because I see that in people that I know, that, people that have been part of my community. They 100% believe that the story of Jonah happened, the story of Genesis happened the way that it did. And they're also wonderful people. But if that's the hill you're going to die on, and that's what you're going to fight people over and hate people over, and, stop listening to their stories and think that they're, even say like, well, you're going to go to hell, I think you need to reconsider and maybe look a little deeper into that.
And I also want to add to that and emphasize the fact that whenever we're looking at the Bible and we're considering what it has to say, if you rip the Bible out of the context of the possibility of God existing, none of it's going to make any sense at all. It's not going to come across as possible whatsoever. This is like somebody was on some super strong drug when they wrote all this stuff. But if God exists in the way that Christians tend to think he does, then Noah's Ark could have been made of paper and it would have worked, because God would have supernaturally held it together, perhaps. Or maybe it would have been a TARDIS-like boat, and it's a lot bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. For anyone who is a Doctor Who fan, which I know very base level Doctor Who. But
I used to be into that. I used to love it.
But if you're considering all of these stories in the context of a God existing who has admin privileges over reality, then there's nothing that the Bible can claim that can be impossible. And so it's one of those things where, like, if you're ever reading the Bible and there's two things that are at odds or something that doesn't seem to make sense, you need to remember that this is in the context of an all-powerful God. And instead of asking, how can this be true? Instead, ask, why might God have chosen to do this? Why might this be the case? For example, we were talking a little while ago about how there's those claims of God bringing fire down from heaven to destroy a city. And I listen to that and I look at that and I think, well, if God's in there, then a fire coming down from heaven to devour a city is totally possible. Why would God choose to do that? And then that's where I get into, why not just snap his fingers and poof, it's gone. That shows the might of God even more so, in my opinion, because that's precision. And then instead of blunt force, like, it seems the blunt force thing makes it seem like God doesn't have the power to be so precise. Anyway.
Yeah. And I would just lastly throw in with that whole mindset is, and if you think about it in the sense of, why would somebody who believes to have interactions with this God, why would they write it this way? Like, why would they describe it in this way? Like, even in a way that maybe happened that way, maybe didn't, but why did the author want it to be said that way? Because most of the time when I get down to that, or, like, we can't know for certain, but whenever I look into that and the human aspect of it, of why did a human write it this way, that's where I find something that is very beautiful and very true. At least that's the angle that I usually approach things is, why would somebody describe it that way?
Instead of viewing it as, this is the work of God, viewing it as, this is the interpretation of a human's observation of what they perception of what they believed was a work of God. Or I mean, there's also the possibility that they're just totally pulling it out of their butt and trying to deceive people. So I mean,
lots of possibilities.
I think that a lot of people look at the possibility of somebody just being deceptive and think, that can't happen. If somebody tried to just pull something random out of their butt, then everybody else would totally be aware of it. And I think what we have a tendency to not realize is, like, back in ancient times, oftentimes a society's religion was whatever the king says. And there wasn't as much of a loyalty complex as we have nowadays. And that's also something that I think is recognized biblically, because the Israelites were incredibly unloyal, and as were many of their kings. So but I think that there's the human element is really important to consider.
Yeah. And I would also say, I think we are just as loyal to authority figures now as people were. I mean, like you said, like people now make cults, like, and people just follow them, you know, like it's not like, you know, people on the outside can look in and be like, oh, I can't believe somebody, but like, you don't understand unless you were a part of it. Like you don't understand what that is like. And we still do it. We still do it all the time.
Yeah. So to circle all the way back around, historical accuracy of the Bible that people try to put forth as proof that it's absolutely true. I think something that we need to consider is that there's such a thing as historical fiction. And the whole premise of historical fiction is to present a historically accurate setting, characters, events, and then weave a fictional story into that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, Forrest Gump. When I first watched Forrest Gump, I was like, whoa, is this historical fiction or is this based on a true story? I hadn't like had the preface to know that. And I was like, it's put together in such a way where it's super convincing. Like they even cut the actor into, I forget his name, into a actual footage where he's shaking hands with FDR. And it's like, or was it FDR? I don't know. But historical fiction is a thing, and that doesn't necessarily make the claims interwoven into any kind of historical account to be true. Well, before we move on to another one, do you have anything to say on that? The historical fiction?
Yeah, I would say, there's so many examples of that. And especially since we are literally thousands of years removed from some of these writings, you know, we're just not going to understand sometimes the style of writing or they weren't going to explicitly say, this is historical fiction. Now read the what I just wrote, you know, just like in a movie, if it's fiction, it's not going to say at the beginning, this is fiction, and then play the movie, even if it looks real. Right.
Yeah.
So,
and people even believe that there's historical fiction in the Bible, like you and I had said already, like Jonah. There's a lot of people who believe that that's just parabolic.
Yeah.
So the other side of that coin is preservation and how well the Bible has been preserved. And I actually made a TikTok on this recently, but a lot of people like to talk about how, we can look at the manuscripts. Like we have, I think it's like 5,500 or some odd number of manuscripts from our earliest records to now that we can refer to. And we can see that there's some discrepancies here and there, but none of them take away from the essentials of evangelism. And then they say, so that's proof that the Bible is true and reliable. What's your thoughts on that claim?
I think that's a jump. That's a leap, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's a testament to how that text has connected with people, with a lot of people over time. To me, that's what I see. As I see, like, this text has meant a lot to a lot of people for a long time. And so they felt it was their duty to preserve that for people in the future. And I think there's something beautiful about that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that proves everything and that was true. Like, that's quite a big jump to say, because it's so well preserved, that means that everything it says is true and God exists exactly in the way that we interpret it.
Yeah. I think it's also important to recognize that we don't really know how well preserved it is. True. Like, we can know how well preserved it is between the earliest documents that we have and up till now. However, in the time between the very first documents being written and the earliest documents we don't have the very first ones. They've long turned to dust. And any biblical historian is going to tell you, we do not have those on record because that's just how deterioration works.
Yeah.
And we also have to recognize that there was a period of time between when the events occurred and when they were written down, and then when there were formal systems put in place to then preserve them.
Yeah.
Prior to the time when there was formal systems put in place to preserve these documents, people were probably copying them left and right. People were talking about it left and right. There wasn't as much. I mean, there was hype. There was a lot of hype. There was a viral period. And during a viral period, it can be really hard to get a hold on what is true and what is not until it kind of dies down a little bit. And then that's like when you get those more rigid preservation efforts.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to say how much has it changed. It's like in the most essential of ways between the first accounts to the earliest documents that we have. We can't know. So we can know that it's well preserved beyond that, but we can't know if it's well preserved further deeper into the past.
Right.
And then I like to think of like other documents, like we have Beowulf, which is like the earliest recorded fictional story. And that's pretty well preserved. Doesn't make it true.
Right. Yeah. Because it wasn't written to be true. And just because something was preserved really well doesn't even mean the author intended for it to be what we interpret it to be. Right. And I think that's another important thing, is what was the author's intent, which once again, impossible to know because we can't ask the author. But just, another thing to think about.
The ontological argument. Are you familiar with that one?
I am familiar with that one. But how about you define it, since you're the one looking at the screen?
Okay. Man, okay. Correct me if I am not doing it justice. And correct us, good listeners, if you don't feel either of us is doing it justice. But it's this idea. Generally, it says that God would be the most perfect being that you could possibly imagine. And because a being that exists is more perfect, it is better and greater than a being that doesn't exist, God must exist. And the biggest issue that I like, this argument pains me.
Yeah.
Because man, I was reading an article just recently on Christian apologetic arguments, and it was talking about how this one's the most compelling. And it's like, literally all you're saying is God exists, therefore God exists.
Yeah.
You're saying you're starting with the assumption that God is. God is. That means God exists. And then you're saying God is the greatest thing you can conceive of.
Yeah.
You're already starting with that assumption that God exists. And then you're using a definition of he's the greatest thing that could exist, therefore God exists. It's literally just God exists, therefore God exists. And that is not a good argument for anything.
No. And yeah, I always thought it was funny because I always thought that was just something to think about. I didn't think that was a proof. It was never compelling to me. Like, because for one, you start with God is the greatest thing you can imagine. So it's just this thing in your head. But even what's funny is if you take that argument and take it to its fullest extent and just keep going and say, well, okay, what's better than a God who creates a place where people suffer for eternity? A God that doesn't. I think that's better, right? So there you go. Doesn't that disprove your ideas of hell? Or what if I think that the greatest thing ever would be that God is a giant unicorn that poops cookies? Like I think so that would
subjective.
Be yeah, like it for one turns subjective because it's up to your imagination of what you think is great and perfect and amazing. And yeah, you can argue those things, but also, if you take it any further, people will start arguing, well, I mean, that doesn't necessarily make God better. I'm like, well, that's your opinion, though. And so, yeah, just something to think about. And it's not a bad thing to think about, but I don't think it proves. I don't think it proves anything.
And my apologies to anybody who's listening to this, grinding their teeth, saying, well, of course it proves this. If we're not giving it enough justice to actually see that, our take on it could be very limited. Our limited take could result in us just not getting it. I recognize that possibility. So please enlighten us if that is the case. And I won't write it off and say that it is absolutely ridiculous, but my particular understanding of it at the moment, it is pretty ridiculous. So, all right, fine-tuning. The concept that everything about our reality is so fine-tuned to our life here on this little planet. That, and also the intricacies of DNA and this whole idea of like comparing humans and life to a machine that can't just pop into existence.
Yeah.
This is something that I found compelling and still feel like is a bit of an assurance towards the possibility for me for a very long time. What is your take on on the fine-tuning argument that there must be a God in order for our reality to be as fine-tuned as it is?
Yeah, I mean, I get it, and for a long time that was very compelling to me, and to some extent it still is, as far as like just the possibility of a God existing. Like I could see that, but
Mm-hmm.
I think where this starts to break down for me and doesn't, I guess, prove anything is as science and our discovery of how the universe came into being, as that advances, we're starting to have more explanations for things that we didn't have explanations for before.
Mm-hmm.
And just because there are things that we can't fully explain doesn't necessarily mean therefore it's God, because for a long time we couldn't explain like very much at all.
Mm-hmm.
Science has been able to explain a lot now, but just because we haven't discovered an explanation for it yet doesn't mean that it has to be God. Now, does it mean even if we can't explain it, that also doesn't negate the fact that it could still be God.
It's very possible that God created a closed system and that none of it relies upon him kind of standing there holding up the foundations.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually another argument that I feel like can be made against this particular argument or rebuttal that can be made against it. But I'm realizing that maybe we should have brought it up a little bit later when we're going to talk about the cosmological argument. But before we jump into that, one other thing that I've heard a lot of people talk about is irreducible complexity as a argument for why there has to have been a God in order for certain life forms to come to existence. I thought that this was compelling for a little while, and then I realized, scaffolding is a thing. Like, we have structures which are these giant rock domes, and if you remove one rock, the whole thing collapses. How did we build those? Well, first we built a bunch of scaffolding, and then we built the rocks around it, and then we removed the scaffolding. And there we have this irreducibly complex structure. And so biologically, that's the same thing can happen. We might have biological life forms which are irreducibly complex, but if you then add different bits to them, like probably parts that were lost over time, suddenly those parts which are irreducibly complex can be removed and you can reduce it to back. So what is your thought on whole irreducible complexity? Like, do you feel like scaffolding is kind of just debunks that argument?
I think it's another thing where that is a possibility in the same sense that saying God did it is a possibility. Like, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know the scientific evolution argument on scaffolding and how organisms became irreducibly complex. I guarantee that there is some answer out there. I don't want to even say that like they're the same possibility, but like I can't prove one over the other, and like either could be right. So it's just one of those things that like, and both could be right also, Yes.
And I'm going to predict the future here because this happens every time I have I bring up something like this. All I'm doing is saying that scaffolding is a possibility.
Yeah.
I am also not a biologist or a scientist. I'm not making the claim that scaffolding is the way it happened. Just like Micah said, it very well might be that God just created these irreducibly complex creatures. But I acknowledge the possibility that it might be that scaffolding in some way, like there's evolutionary scaffolding that allowed these irreducibly complex creatures to come into existence. Or rather these like coexistent creatures, like where one creature cannot survive without another one. Scaffolding.
And I would say for that, go ask a scientist, go do some research, because we don't have the authority to speak on that.
Exactly. All we have is the position to say, hey, from our limited standpoints and our limited understanding, we can see both of these things as being possibilities. Now, if you guys in the comments disagree and present some really compelling arguments to suggest that scaffolding is impossible, then that's going to be awesome. We look forward to learning that. And hopefully other people in the comments will learn that too. This is going to be a meaty one. And this will probably be the one that we'll end on. Cosmological argument. would you like to explain to the class what the cosmological argument is?
The cosmological argument I used to know pretty well. I'm trying to remember the exact way to describe it. Is it the idea of there must be a first cause?
Yes.
And that God would be the uncaused cause, like something that is outside of space, time, matter, that was not created and has nothing created it, had to have started creation and caused it to begin because of infinite regression. Like there can't be an infinite amount of time before the universe started, or we would never have reached today, because you would infinitely go back in time. So there had to be some start date. Therefore, God must have started, or something outside of that time must have started it.
Yeah, that's the premise. Essentially, it acknowledges the reality of entropy ever being on the rise and matter continuously moving towards evaporating into pure energy. And how if the universe was eternal, we would have already reached that point. There would be no entropy to rise. It would be maxed out at this point.
Yeah.
And that suggests that there had to be, well, a lot of people say it suggests the beginning. I would venture to say that it suggests that there's some physical law that we have which shouldn't be considered a law. And that would be either entropy exists as like a sine wave where it rises and it falls cyclically. And our entire existence has been in the time that it has been accelerating. And so we've only ever witnessed the acceleration of entropy and the universe expanding. We haven't existed long enough to see it start to slow, stop, and then reverse. So there's also the possibility that entropy is irregular in different places. Because I mean, space-time is a thing and time passes differently in different places.
Yeah.
So it might be that there's just a bunch of irregular pockets of like if you're out on the ocean, there's not just one continuous wave that's just going, it's just a bunch of waves all jumbled up all over the place of different magnitudes. And if entropy is like that, then the universe is constantly in this state of being shuffled around, and all the molecules are constantly being shuffled. And I call it like the molecular shuffle. And of course, I'm not talking from a point of expertise. This is a hypothesis. This is my guess. This is a possibility that I recognize. And if molecules are constantly being shuffled, we do believe energy and matter cannot be created, cannot be destroyed. And so that would accentuate that it's eternal. And if entropy can go back down, then we know that it's not just going to expand forever. All of these things considered, any combination of molecules that can exist will exist eventually. And that is why we see the fine tuning that we do. Or it could be a reason why we see the fine tuning that we do, because it's just a possible combination of molecules. It will happen, and it will happen again. So in a way, we've had this conversation an infinite amount of times, and we will have this conversation an infinite more number of times. So it's kind of this idea of like an infinite universe, but it's only one universe, like the multiverse theory, but it's only one universe that's just constantly shuffling.
Yeah, I was about to say we just entered the multiverse, like
right. And then there's the multiverse possibility. It could be that entropy isn't what we think it is. It could be that matter being created and being destroyed isn't what we think it is. And that's kind of where Christians tend to lean, in that matter can be created. It just has to be created by an external being, a being that is not of our universe. Now, the problem with that is the very moment that we suggest that there exists a reality or a God that is a reality beyond our reality. And in this space, in this external reality, the physical laws that we're used to do not apply. We cannot suggest that any attribute is necessary for anything that exists in the external reality. Because to suggest that there has to be an intelligent being existing in this external reality in order for our reality to be what it is, you are taking your understanding of the reality we exist in and how intention comes from intelligence,
Hmm.
and applying that to a reality where maybe that's not the case.
Oh my. Yeah. I mean, you're right. You're right. My brain is having a tough time wrapping my mind around that. And I think it's because it's impossible to wrap our mind around something that
exactly.
vast. But I think that is a really good point. Like there could be an explanation out there that that could be natural to, I guess, the world, but
reality,
in a way that we just can't fathom that. Yeah, I don't know. My brain is like exploding right now because I've never heard those explanations.
This is an argument that like I've been making for a while, and I finally kind of boiled it down to its essentials. And that's just this idea that like what exists in that external reality might be an intelligent God. It might be an unintelligent supernatural forces of nature, or force of supernature in this instance. We cannot, from our reality, determine what characteristics or attributes would be necessary in that external reality to result in our universe. And that's something that I think is a thing that Christians come up against when they try and use the cosmological argument, saying that there has to be an intelligent God. No, they're just, in this instance, like, I mean, if the law that we don't understand, if there is an external reality, it could be anything.
Yeah, it could be. It could be a number of gods. It could be so many different things. Like that could potentially point to something that maybe put things in motion or whatever, but it doesn't necessarily prove I guess if I'm speaking to Christians, typically in a very specific denomination, it doesn't prove your specific interpretation of who God is and all of that. It could get you closer. But once again, there could be other explanations for it that we need to be willing to explore. Like if we're going to be intellectually honest with the pursuit of spirituality and God, then you have to be willing to give validity and thought to other possibilities that you might not understand, because maybe you were just raised with, this is it. And you were told this is the answer. But other people were probably told it was a different answer, or have explored other answers. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to do here is like, we need to open our minds that like, yeah, you were told that this is the answer and this is just the way it is. But we need to have empathy for other people who have had other answers, and also genuinely listen to their thoughts and the things that they have been told. Because
that's how we pursue truth.
Right. Exactly.
Or at least the best version or the closest thing to truth that we can get.
Yeah. And if truth is like, if there is truth, like singular truth to an issue, then you shouldn't be afraid of exploring other options, because those other options should only lead you back to the truth, which some people will say, oh, I did. And I came back and like, did you explore this one though? And maybe they did and just think that theirs is better.
For sure.
So who knows?
I couldn't set it better myself. Wow, we managed to cover it all.
Yeah,
it might be a little bit of a longer episode, but
yeah, definitely. Well, cool. I mean, there's a lot to cover when talking about the existence of God, and next week will be an important conversation, because that's not just the existence of God, but the existence of a specific kind of God.
Yes,
if God exists.
I think that we've managed to, from our limited pool of knowledge between the two of us, successfully show that it's possible God exists. It's possible God doesn't exist. We've shown the reasons for those two different possibilities. And I think, and I hope that our listeners would agree that we did justice the different sides. And if we didn't, hopefully, then I really hope that our listeners will be vocal in correcting us and stating what they find to be truth and including their knowledge into this pool. And we might return to this topic, having learned new things from you guys. So, yeah.
Definitely. And we're just here putting our thoughts together, and we want your thoughts as well. And
just pondering in the morning.
Exactly. Yeah, it's pretty deep topics to be diving into after just waking up. So
well, I mean, is it better than diving into them before falling asleep or trying to fall asleep?
That's fair. We could get into some weird things.
Our apologies to everybody out there who's listening to this before they fall to sleep, but now you're finding it difficult because
yeah, the realities of this world are not as I thought. But anyway, just to reiterate, whatever you believe about these different arguments and whatever stance you hold, you have space here to ponder with us. And we're not here to convince anyone of anything. We're just trying to ponder these things in an honest way, and in a way that we hope is helpful and just honest in the search of truth.
Yes, and you are free to express your view on the topics, and we are to some extent here to learn from you. So yeah, I look forward to our conversation next week. I was getting a little impatient about this conversation, really excited to talk about it, and I think it went really well. So
definitely, I'm excited for next week.
Thank you so much for the conversation, Micah. And if you want to find Micah and I on TikTok, you can find Micah at Pondering Together, and you can find me at Truth Voyager. And thank you everybody for listening.
Yep, we will see you next time.
See you next time. You guys have a great day. So my mind goes blank again.
It's easy to edit. Don't worry.
Yeah. Take a breath. Think for a second.
Yeah.
So like you were saying,